You describe the end of Israel not as destruction, but as decolonization, a peaceful transition if we're lucky. But you very confidently write, Ilan, the question of the collapse is not about if, but when. In real terms, in real life, in the real world, what would a non-violent collapse of Zionism, a non-violent decolonization of the state of Israel, of Palestine, what would that require inside of Israel, Palestine, and inside of the US?
Yeah. Well, this is more wishful thinking than the rest of the book is analysis. This part is a bit being on the hopeful side
Yes.
because history teaches me that rarely was decolonization achieved without violence, unfortunately. But I wish it for everyone concerned that it would
Yes.
be so let's say as peaceful as possible rather than, absolutely peaceful. I don't really think this is possible. For that to happen, there is a very clear formula. If you don't want the Palestinian national movement, that given a balance of power on the ground, to act desperately, as it did act on the 7th of October, the international community has to offer an alternative. And the alternative is very clear. Sanctions on Israel, pressure on Israel, Europe and the United States together hold the key economically for the survival of Israel as what I call the state of Judea, namely a state that continues to oppress the Palestinians and intimidate the region as a whole.
Is
There is an alternative. If you want it to be as peaceful as possible, the world, that is the Western world, that created Israel in 1947-48
yeah.
without consulting anyone in the Arab world, in fact, without consulting anyone in the colonized world in 1947-48,
Yeah.
this particular part of the world has to undo it in a
So
way that hopefully would be positive and beneficial for everyone concerned.
Ilan, you've long argued that Zionism is a settler colonial project, and you do so in this book as well. A very provocative phrase to a lot of Zionists and supporters of Israel to say colonial or settler colonial. What do you say to Zionists who say, well, Jews have long-standing ties to the land? They are indigenous as well. Zionism was a return to their ancestral land. This is not akin to the British white men going into India and colonizing India. It's not the same thing. What do you say in response to that argument?
Well, if the Jews are indigenous to Palestine, so are all the Christians and the Muslim in the world are indigenous to Palestine. The spiritual connection of the three religions to the Holy Land is very well known, but it's not a platform that justifies colonization and dispossession. In other words, Jews did pilgrimage to Palestine or had gone on pilgrimage to Palestine long before Zionism appeared and continued their connection to the Holy Land as much as Muslim and Christians did. This is a very different project. This is a project that has nothing to do with a connection to the land. It has to do with Europe's inability in the
Yeah.
late 19th century to solve anti-Semitism. So they decided to build a European state instead of Europe that didn't want them at the heart of the Arab world. Similar outcasts in Europe earlier centuries built European countries at the expense of indigenous people elsewhere. By the way, also using religion as a
Yeah.
claim
I mean,
of a
so
right to the
so
land.
so I've always found it fascinating that this is about the ties to the land, but of course we know from the early Zionists they were considering Africa and South America as possible bases.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't like it was automatically Palestine was the only place. But having said that, is there not something to the argument from people who say when the British went into India, there was no connection whatsoever. When the Dutch went into parts of Africa, there was no connection whatsoever. Whether you agree with it or not, Jewish people who are doing Aliyah and returning to Palestine in their heads, that is a connection. They're not going in their heads. And I just want to, I'm trying to present the other side
No,
of the
no, I
argument as
understand what
best
you're
they would.
saying.
In their heads, they would say, we're not going with any kind of colonial mentality. We're going home.
Well, it's like the Crusaders had the same argument, and they built a Crusader state. They had the connection to Jerusalem. I mean, after all, Jesus Christ was crucified there, and he was born in Nazareth. So it was used before.
But they would say we actually ran a kingdom there. We actually lived unbroken hundreds of
3,000
years
years before.
in a way that, yeah, of course, that's
Yeah.
the problem.
I mean, can you imagine someone knocking on your door in Brooklyn and say, excuse me, I used to live in your house 3,000 years ago. Here's the police. They
Yeah,
will evict you
it is
from your
insane.
flat because I have this. This is absurd. I mean, I don't even argue with the validity of the narrative. I don't believe people know exactly who they are descended of, giving the passage of
That's a good
3,000
point.
years. I have no idea.
I
But I don't care if Mehdi Hassan want to say that his ancestors 3,000 years were people you really like. You are totally entitled to choose your
yeah.
3,000 years old ancestors. What you are not entitled to do is, in the name of that narrative, to colonize a country and dispossess its indigenous people.
Uh,
It's the very act in the name of the narrative rather than the narrative.